40 extremely positive reports. And it ranges from Gilbert and George, for whom the East End is a kind of Jerusalem, and still a Jerusalem after 20 years. But I think what is extremely necessary is your kind of critical sense on London, or interpretation of London, and particularly on the myth that London is a great and voluntary assembly of many races. And your text, London Inside Out, is one of the rare texts that actually questions that mythology. So can you talk about that issue, please?
Yeah, yes. I mean, I wouldn't want to question it in the sense that, do you remember the day after the bombing and Ken Livingstone was still out in Singapore and we'd just won the Olympics and all that stuff? And Ken Livingstone spoke about London in a really moving way and spoke about it. He called it actually the future of the world. And he spoke about the collection of cultures and ethnicities that there is gathered here in London. And there is no doubt, I mean, if you look at it statistically, qualitatively, in loads and loads of ways, that is the case. And there's no doubt also that there is both, I think, a political level and a street level commitment to anti-racism in this place. That doesn't mean that there isn't racism. It's horrendous. It doesn't mean that there aren't daily monstrosities going on the streets. But I think it is nonetheless, in a very general sense, an amazingly tolerant place. And Ken celebrated that. And I would want to go along with that. But what I also want to do, and in celebrating that, he said that that was London's character as a world city, right, as a global city. And I don't in any way want to go against that. What I would like to do is kind of turn that question around and ask about London as a global city in terms of its effects on the rest of the world. And there's lots of ways in which that works. I mean, first of all, it's quite interesting to look at multiculturalism outwards. I mean, yeah, there's loads of different groups, loads of different ethnicities gathered here in London. But Ken said they've come here to be free, to be able to be themselves, and things like that. And in some senses, that is true. But people have also come here because of poverty in the rest of the world, because globalization has made it impossible for them to keep living on the land in which they have historically lived. They've come here because of wars. And one of the questions I want us as Londoners, insofar as we are Londoners, to ask is to what extent is what goes on in London in part responsible for the poverty in the rest of the world. So that's one thing. To question that other side of London global city, which is London as a propagator of deregulation, privatization, neoliberalization. It started here. London isn't a global city just because it's open to the wider world. It's a global. It reinvented itself in the 80s, and if you want to come back to this, I think the 80s was absolutely crucial. It reinvented itself in the 80s on the back of privatization, neoliberalization, commercialization of everything. And I think we as Londoners need to question that. But there's also more ordinary ways. London couldn't go on without the immigration that comes to this city. One example I give in the article you mentioned, Rem, is nurses. We absolutely depend, when we go to, I was in hospital yesterday, we absolutely depend for the running of this city, the daily, social, ordinary reproduction of this city in a whole host of ways, on people that have come from the global south and also increasingly now from the east of Europe. And the example I give is nurses from Ghana. What we're doing is taking skilled labor from those countries. I read a statistic the other day that between a half and a third and a half of all professionally trained people in Ghana are not in Ghana. They are in first world countries, servicing our needs. That is a hugely difficult problem, because I don't want to say people shouldn't come. I mean, those on the left are caught in a vice there. On the one hand, we want to say, of course, there should be free immigration. On the other hand, we want to stop the brain drain from the third world, from the global south. And it's those kinds of issues I'd like us to put on the agenda, not to celebrate London, there's a load of stuff to celebrate it, but also ask some of the difficult questions about what that celebration depends on in the wider world.
I was very interested in the whole notion of the local and the global in relation to this argument. And you, as you mentioned, that it's necessary to look beyond the local place to trace its implications around the world.
Yeah.
And you then come to a conclusion, still in this incredible text, London Inside Out, which was really a key text for Rem and me to prepare this whole marathon. It's a text we always came back to. There's one thing I wanted you to ask you to maybe explain us, which is, you talk about the global production of the local, where very often the local is seen as a kind of a victim of globalization. Yeah. But you say that we should not only look at that, but also at the local production of the global. So I wanted to ask if you could tell us these sort of two flip things in relation to the local and the global.
I think very often in political campaigning around globalization, we see the local as the kind of product of the global, and the local as the victim of the global. You know, global forces coming into your region and smashing it up in various ways, causing the destruction of local communities, causing the closure of factories and all those kinds of things. And in many places that is absolutely true. You know, in industrial towns in the north of England, that is the dominant thing that is going on. In many places in the global south, that is the dominant thing that is going on. But it seems to me if we generalize that story, we end up kind of letting the local off the hook. We're exonerating the local. Because the global isn't produced up there. It's not always somewhere else. It's not some kind of ethereal sphere that just exists nowhere. Globalization is produced in local places. And what I'm trying to argue for is a geography of the understanding of that. And London is one of the key places in which globalization is produced. And that means that we in London cannot say, oh, we must defend our local place against global outside forces. And that is said a lot. It's said in the London Plan on numerous occasions. We also have to take responsibility for the production of the globalization that we are now on the streets fighting. So there's a way in which we have to think about the local production of the global as well as the global production of the local. It's what more generally I call a politics of place beyond place. That when we're thinking about our places, we shouldn't just be defensive about them. We shouldn't just think about what's going on within them. We should try and plot what the impacts of those places are around the rest of the planet. And in some senses, try and take some kind of political responsibility for that, both in street-level campaigning and through local councils and such.
Can you say a little bit more? Because I think that in terms of politics, and we talked about politics from 6 o'clock to midnight, there was a kind of real sense of ineffectuality and powerlessness. Do you see a way in which people like us could be effective in kind of resisting some of these things still at this moment against the seemingly overwhelming, seemingly satanic, seemingly unstoppable?
Yeah, I mean, I was part of the GLC of the 1980s as well, and I think that moment was really crucial. At that moment, it wasn't necessary. It somehow wasn't already pre-given that neoliberal globalization and finance and everything would come and dominate. And we lost that moment in all kinds of ways, not just through the GLC being abolished, but across a whole set of social struggles, we lost that moment. And neoliberal dogma, this new, vastly wealthy elite that you yourself, both of you, write about, came to dominate the social scene. What that meant was that London pursued a particular path. It also meant, I think, the victory of London over the rest of the country, which is another issue. And so now, 20, 30 years later, we have another Greater London, this time Assembly, with much reduced powers, because, of course, Labour was as much opposed to the GLC as the Tories ever were. They saw it as far too radical. But this time, as well as having reduced powers, it's in a situation where neoliberalism is well established. It's very much harder to buck the trend. And if you look at all the plans and the documents that are being produced, they all basically accept that. The London plan says London has reinvented itself. Those are the terms that are used in the documents. And the way in which it's reinvented itself is as this global financial capital. And the plan says go ahead with it. Now, I think there are things we can do. So I think the situation is glum, no doubt. I mean, the last interviewee said things were fine. I severely do not think that. I feel incredibly depressed at times. But I do think there are things that can be done. We can question the dominance of finance. I mean, even calling London a global city in that way is to prioritise in our imagination of the place just that bit of it which is finance. I mean, it's quite a lot of it, but it isn't all of it. There's a hell of a lot of other things that go on in London that are also part of this place. So it's a kind of substitution of the part for the whole, and the rest of us become invisible by that designation of London as a financial city centre above everything else. So we can challenge that. We can get debates around our dependence upon immigration onto the streets as live debates. We can plot. I mean, there's an arts group platform that has done a lot of work just plotting the role of London and London-based institutions in what happened in the Niger Delta over the years through Ken Saro-Wiwa's execution and the current politics of oil. And just plotting London's presence in those battles. And there's a lovely map at the end of their book called The Next Gulf where it says, the Niger Delta in London. In other words, the things which are part of our daily infrastructure, part of our daily lives, absolutely essential to the city in which we live, and yet producing such havoc and chaos in other parts of the world. So I think there's, at all kinds of levels, there's campaigns that can be waged and debates that can be set up. Yes, you can't afford, basically, to be so despondent you don't do anything.
But it's exactly that idea what we can actually do, which I wanted to ask you more about in terms of production of reality. I was somehow wondering if you had any kind of dreams for London or any kind of projects in terms of the future of London you'd imagine.
I don't think I'm that megalomaniac. And I'm much more street level in my thinking. Actually, that's not entirely true. Because I try and engage in debate at like GLA. I still accidentally continue to call it the GLC. That's a Freudian slip. I do engage in debate at the GLA level. I do think we should have arguments about the London plan, criticisms of the London plan, which are not only about its likely effects within the city, but which also think about the effects of London in the country as a whole and in the globe as a whole. So I do think we need to engage at that level, and I don't think it's a battle that is impossible to win.
And
to
in
get
this
some
context,
changes.
how do you see the Olympics? As the death knell or a potential new direction or bifurcation?
I was not in favour of the Olympic bid. No. In part because the Olympics has become such a kind of marketing vehicle for a small number of major corporations, and as a way of kind of engineering the body into something you almost don't want it to be, and people are so hyped up into being top athletes. So the whole business from what the Olympics are to, is that the only way we can regenerate the Lee Valley and the East End? No, of course it's not. There are other ways of doing that, which are much more bottom-up, which are much more street-level, which are much more community-based. And that was what, I think, in the 80s, not just in London, but in lots of cities, the old municipal left, as we used to call it, that's what we were trying to do. That was in a sense, when the social democratic consensus broke down in this country between the 60s, 70s, 80s, there were different ways out of it. There was Thatcherism and neoliberalism and the far right. And there was a breakout to the left. And some of the municipal socialism of that period was trying to think about what that might be. The Labour Party, of course, was terrified by any idea like that. It found itself in this vacuum called the Third Way, refused to stand up for the other alternative, and Thatcherism won out. And here we are. That is how I would see that trajectory. So yes, times are tough.
Now, preparing the marathon, one of the first meetings was with Eric Hobsbawm, and he said we should, resist amnesia. We should stage a protest against forgetting. And we followed his advice and asked all the speakers if there are kind of toolboxes from the past which they think in terms of their own field are particularly relevant. Now you are, as a professor of geography, in terms of influence, venturing into all kinds of other fields. I mean, many of my artist friends, such as Olafur Eliasson, are hugely inspired by your books. And I was wondering kind of what were your inspirations? What were your kind of, I mean, heroes is a kind of a big word, but what were sort of things from the past in terms of geography or other fields which had somehow influenced your practice and which you think we could add to our list of toolboxes which we are putting together here?
Yeah, I heard you ask earlier about heroes, and I thought, oh my God, because I don't have heroes. I mean, there are other lives which I find fascinating. Tina Modotti, a photographer, kind of who mixed art, politics, a weird life, a continual commitment and travelling everywhere. I died in a taxi on the way home from a party at a rather early age, and somehow, you know, as lives go, that seemed to me to be pretty impressive. She was in Spain for the Civil War. She was in Mexico for the revolution, and so on and so forth. But I don't have heroes. But I think Eric's right about forgetting, and I think there are projects to make us forget. There has been an awful lot of attempts to make us forget, even the 60s, and then again the GLC of the 80s. There are the ways in which they get referenced in hegemonic discourses is as dismissal, is as jokey. People are sarcastic about them. Absolutely. And it's a deliberate strategy of erasure from our memory of some of those times when we did have hope, when there were ideas. Little ones, not great big ones, not utopian strategies, but things happening. And we mustn't let them do that. We mustn't let them wipe those from our memories. On the side of more my work as a geographer, which you mentioned, I think we underestimate the challenge of space itself, of spatiality itself. There's a lot of understanding of the challenge of time as the dimension of change, as the dimension in which we'll all die and all that kind of stuff. And one of my long struggles, I guess, has been to reawaken and to put on the agenda much more the challenge of space. I think if time is the dimension of change, then space is the dimension of multiplicity. It's the dimension in which more than one thing can exist at once. In fact, if that wasn't true, there wouldn't even be space. So it is space, in a sense, which is the necessary dimension for the social. Space is the dimension in which we encounter the other. If we fully recognize space, then we have to respect the other. Derrida associates space with the attitude of respect, that full recognition of the absolute coexistence now, at this same moment, of others. And we adopt strategies all the time to evade that. When we think about globalization, we talk about developed countries and developing countries. And that's like saying those other countries aren't different from us now. They're just behind us in some singular historical queue. So Nicaragua or Mozambique or somewhere. They're behind, they're developing. They will one day be just like us. And that is to deny their actually existing difference. It is to say there is only one way of developing. Yeah, and it's also, of course, absolutely to occlude our own involvement in their lack of economic development. And that, to me, is not taking space seriously. It's turning space into time, turning the differentiation of space now into one singular historical queue. And that's just one little example of the ways in which I think, through our implicit political imaginations, we evade the challenge of space.
Is the space you were talking about the same space that architects work in? And this
I've wondered about that for donkey's years, because I work with architects a lot.
Or can it be?
Can it be related? I think it can be related. What I'm on about is space as a dimension, in the same way as time is a dimension. So in the end, it's probably more abstract. I'm not thinking about spaces in quite the same way as you may be as architects. However, one aspect of space as a dimension that I would want to stress is that it is always in process of production. Quite often we think of time as like all these things going on, all these stories going on, and space as just a dead flat, already finished, cut through time, a slice through time. And I want to emphasize the fact that space is actually a cut through millions of stories. In that book, wherever it is, I call it a simultaneity of stories so far. Space is the fact that, well, right now in Lebanon, it's just after midday. And right now, something is happening in Lebanon that we will hear on the news tonight. Right now in the Antarctic, it is dark, and there's this frozen stillness of midwinter. Right now in Latin America, it's still midnight or just after. And it's that feeling of the multiplicity of space that I want to get hold of. Now, if we think of space like that, then the way it relates to architectural practices is, I think, as thinking of space as the intersections of stories, as socially produced, as always moving. And one of the essential contradictions then with architecture is that, in a sense, you're enclosing it, pinning it down, carving off bits of it. And I think that's just a tension. But it is related to the space I'm talking about, but not exactly the same. It's not the same.
Many, many thanks, Doreen Massey. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.